What is Frozen Ark and what is your vision?
So the Frozen Ark is a biobanking charity, but the unusual thing that we biobank is the DNA and genetic material from endangered animal species. And because extinctions are happening so rapidly across the globe at the moment, more and more species are coming close to extinction. And if we don't save their genetic material before they go extinct, we'll lose it completely. And there are many examples now of species that have gone extinct before we even discovered them.
What's different about Frozen Ark?
I think one of the most important aspects of what's different about the Ark is our focus purely on endangered species. There are other frozen arks out there that focus on zoos, but they're not necessarily just focusing on endangered species. That's always been our interest and our vision. But at the same time, I think the collaborative federated model that we operate, which is a big collaboration between many different institutions, is important. So what we do is we provide the advice, the guidance, the database, and the frozen facilities, and they're dotted around. So in the UK, we have them at 5 or 6 different locations, not just one location, not just in Cardiff or Nottingham. So it is a collaborative model that is basically bringing organisations such as the British Zoo community, the aquarium community, the museums, and the research labs in the institutions and the universities all together and kind of providing the infrastructure to make that all happen and make those genetic samples be safely looked after in a number of different locations and properly recorded and databased.
How does having a common database help the Frozen Ark in its conservation activities? And what are the challenges in putting that together?
Obviously, it's important that we collect and conserve genetic material for humanity's future, but we also need to use it for conservation programs now. And that is why the Frozen Ark is an active biobank. So for example, if a zoo wants to run a breeding program, it needs to know where all of the individuals are across the world, whose genetics it can bring together to maximise the population's fitness and chance of survival. And we can also store sperm and eggs, and we could use those sperm and eggs into the future to rescue genetic diversity when the population has been small for a long time, even though that individual is long dead.
What would you say are the biggest challenges to Frozen Ark? What do you need?
Well, the Frozen Ark is in a race against time. I think everybody recognises that. We're losing species very, very rapidly. We are in the 6th mass extinction. There's also a lot of issues around the institutional structures. There hasn't historically been a lot of funding for biobanking, except for humans and for things like cancer tissues and disease and other human tissues where there's a huge amount of investment. But I think the non-model animal, endangered animal species biobanking activities have been a sideshow really and have not been properly invested in. So we're dealing with often antiquated infrastructure. So let's say a zoo, just a zoo anywhere, not a big one. They might have an old rusty -20 freezer, you know, an old freezer that they used to have in the kitchen and now is storing samples that the vets have collected. They won't have a database. It'll be written down on bits of paper, and there won't be a backup. So there's all the infrastructural issues as well. So a whole variety of different challenges. And then getting all of the parties to come together and work together in a collaborative environment is in itself quite difficult. I'm not saying we've solved that, but we seem to have traction with most of these organisations and they believe us. We have a long enough history and track record in this area so that they will follow our guidance and collaborate.
Now, this is obviously cutting-edge science, but is there a way that the general public can also help?
So the Frozen Ark relies on the general public. We rely on the general public as our advocates. We have an active social media following, and that's great. And I think it's important because biobanking and biobanking of endangered species is not something that people think about very much. They go to zoos to see live animals. They don't go to zoos to see test tubes. Yet, the people who advocate for us really get the fact that we need to keep this material if we're going to be able to equip the life of the planet to evolve into the future under climate change and other scenarios.
Now, despite all you've achieved, there's obviously a long way to go. And I just wondered if you could send out one message to the other conservation bodies and institutions, both in the UK and abroad. What would that be?
I think they have to understand and appreciate that genetic diversity is as important as species diversity and as ecosystems are. And that will require a paradigm shift in many of those organisations. So in their daily activities, when they are, for example, handling an animal in a hospital, whether they are walking around a reserve and finding something that's been killed, or even as little as a poo sample, that they should be thinking about collecting that material and maintaining it and storing it in a responsible manner and getting in touch with us. Because we think about biodiversity mainly in terms of species and ecosystems. We're not used to thinking about genetic material, but it is the most basic part of biodiversity. Without genetic diversity, future life can't evolve. It's as simple as that. So they've got to be thinking about that, and it's got to be running through their processes and their institutional protocols. And it is also something that I think is a potentially great importance to them in getting their message out, because they're conserving then all levels of biodiversity, not just species, for example.